Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's National Extension Climate Initiative Professional Development webinar. By way of logistics, I want to mention that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the NECI website at a later time. The snacks and restrooms are where you last left them. This is a Zoom meeting. There will be a poll or survey that will be posted at the conclusion of this presentation, and I will verbally acknowledge that later. That will be completely voluntary, and you can choose to fill that out if you will, but we certainly encourage it. Our presenter today is Rachel Bezner Kerr, and a little introduction for her. She is a professor of global development at Cornell University with a background in sociology, environmental science, and international development. She does long-term research in Malawi and Tanzania, using participatory research methods to test the impacts of agroecological approaches on livelihoods, nutrition, and sustainable land management for rural communities. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Rachel. And at this time, please share with us your knowledge.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here with you today. And you might be asking yourself, why is a social scientist who does research in Africa talking to us, folks who work in the United States? One of the reasons that I think David asked if I might be interested is because I have had the privilege of serving on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the most recent assessment report. And I was one of the coordinating authors for the chapter on food systems for the section on the working group on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And so while I may get to mention the I think I just say okay here, the work in Africa, most of my focus today will be on the findings from that report as it pertains to the United States context. And so just a quick review, this is a body of the United Nations. It's made up of scientists of all stripes, social scientists, physical scientists, and there are three different parts. So I wasn't working on the part on the physical evidence for climate change, that's working group 1, but on the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability section, working group 2. And I also was not involved in the mitigation section, so that is working group 3, but I did contribute to the summary for policymakers, the overall section of the report for working group 2, as well as the coordinating author for the food system section. So it's an interesting organization because in addition to being made up of scientists work sort of reporting to governments, it is at arm's, so it's at arm's length. So the phrase that is used is scientists hold the pen. So it's to provide policy relevant information, but not prescriptive, and it's all volunteers. So all of us were doing this on top of our regular day job. The report for Working Group 2, which we released 2 years ago, had 270 authors, and then there were contributing authors on top of that who contributed, might be a paragraph or 2 sentences based on their expertise. We assessed more than 34,000 scientific papers. So this is an overall assessment, and then our expert sort of a delivery of policy relevant information to governments, as well as other interested parties who use this report. And it's like one giant scientific article in the sense that we post drafts online and then receive feedback from anyone. Any scientist can sign up to provide feedback, and we then have to provide responses to that feedback, and those responses are posted online. So what did we find from our assessment of the literature? There were kind of 5 key messages coming out of the report for our chapter. First of all, there's extremely robust evidence that climate change is already impacting food production with significant impacts on food security and nutrition in many regions. We did a very thorough assessment of adaptation options to reduce risk from climate change. And there are many effective and feasible adaptation options that often have synergies with other societal goals, be it biodiversity or addressing livelihoods. But most adaptation is being done on an incremental basis and is not being done fast enough or in a transformative way that's really required for what the risks entail with climate change. And we also found that there's a whole body of adaptation options that we have under the umbrella of ecosystem-based adaptation that really not only reduce climate risk, but bolster biodiversity and ecosystem services that then support food production long-term. And importantly, the process of developing adaptation options is as crucial as the actual adaptation option itself for ensuring that it has positive impact. So I'll be going through some of these findings in more detail. It hopefully isn't a surprise to you to know that climate change is already impacting food systems around the world, including here in North America. Some of the scientific evidence suggests that agricultural productivity across North America has been reduced by approximately 12.5% because of impacts from climate change since the 1960s. So our productivity is not what it would be if we weren't being subject to human-induced climate change. And there's also been increased evidence of not only long-term impacts on agricultural productivity, but impacts on the underlying ecosystem services that support our food system. And that includes things like pollination and overall soil health. And more evidence about the impacts of acute climate events, climate-related hazards. I just pulled a photograph from the recent wildfires being experienced in Texas and other parts of the United States. So wildfires, but also floods, droughts, storm surges, and these have impacts in many different walks of life. But in terms of food systems, it puts particular groups at greater risk. And these groups vary by place, but include women, children, low-income households, smallholder farmers, Indigenous people and other ethnic minorities, and farm workers. And these groups within food systems are at greater risk of livelihood loss and food insecurity and nutrition impacts, as well as competition for scarce resources because of climate change impacts. So in addition to those vulnerable groups are here in the United States, there's evidence that even though we are at lower risk from climate change impacts for our food systems compared to other regions, particular groups are at greater risk for livelihood loss and food security and nutrition impacts. But there are also particular regions of the world that are at greater risk, and this is likely not a surprise, at risk of acute food insecurity events, because of climate change impacts. And so this includes a large part of the globe: Africa, Asia, Central and South America, the Arctic, and small islands, where it's been observed this in the scientific literature, this link between these extreme events and reduced food security and reduced nutrition or increased malnutrition. And another thing that's increasingly in the scientific literature are more complex events for climate change. So it's not just a drought that then causes food insecurity, but it's cascading events. So you may get impacts on food prices. You may have a dampening of food labor productivity because of heat stress. You may get compounding effects from contamination due to rising temperatures, so food spoilage, leading to impacts on nutrition and food security outcomes. And then you can have the interaction with non-climate shocks, whether they're economic shocks or conflict, which can worsen the impacts of a climate change event. And all of these can lead to reducing people's access to safe and nutritious food. The example from this illustration is a drought in Lesotho in southern Africa, which the impacts were compounded by a combination of food contamination, the rising food prices, and difficulty in getting food through to the region on time. In terms of future projections, it's anticipated that unless we very significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and hold them to 1.5% or 1.5 degrees Celsius or lower, we're going to see increases in heat stress, water scarcity, more dramatic impacts on food security and nutrition, and flood risk. So the future is grim unless we very significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And in case you missed it, the Working Group 1 report was unequivocal in the scientific evidence that humans are causing global warming, and that this is leading to these very severe climate change impacts. So on to thinking about the positive part of our report. We reviewed over 1,000 papers looking at adaptation options within the food system. And there is a wealth of literature. Interestingly, most of it is not in North America. A lot of it is in Africa and in Central and South America. Africa and Asia, not in North America or Central and South America. And most of the adaptation initiatives are incremental, they're focused on single sector, and they're smaller scale. But there is a wealth of literature in food systems. And there is evidence that these adaptation options reduce risk, but it's currently insufficient in light of the climate risks that we are already facing within food systems. And most of the adaptation measures being deployed are what's called autonomous, meaning a farmer is taking on a new crop variety or changing their method of improving soil health, or they're changing the timing of planting on their own, not through a kind of widespread policy initiative. And so these measures, while they are reducing climate risks, aren't enough to eradicate the risks. So overall, the adaptation in food systems has increased since the last assessment report, but the progress is uneven, and it's not fast enough. On the other hand, many of the adaptation options that have been assessed in the scientific literature are both effective and feasible. And we used the methodology that was spearheaded by a previous IPCC report, what's sometimes referred to as the Land Report in 2019, where we looked not only at feasibility in terms of technical feasibility, but we looked at political, social, environmental feasibility. And we also looked at the effectiveness from multiple dimensions. So effectiveness in reducing climate risks, but what about other benefits, other effectiveness dimensions, social, political, environmental. And we found many of the options available within food systems are both effective and feasible from these multiple dimensions. Some of the ones to highlight include what many people think of initially as cultivar improvements. But there is also this wider swath of options under kind of ecosystem-based adaptation, such as agroforestry, agroecosystem diversification, and agroecological approaches. And I'll be talking about some of those as examples. And then there are also strategies that really hone in on the approach or the process by which the adaptation option is developed. So community-based adaptation is one such example. And in addition to reducing climate risk, they provide these different options provide wider benefits, such as improving food security, improving incomes, addressing health and well-being, and bolstering and supporting ecosystem services and biodiversity. So really ensuring long-term viability of food systems, as well as the other benefits that these ecosystem services provide. So things like water quality, for example. We looked as well, and I don't have a slide, but we looked at the overlap between these different approaches and the different sustainable development goals. And there was a strong overlap with many of the sustainable development goals by taking on these adaptation strategies. So it's not just reducing climate risk, but you're leading to benefits in terms of livelihoods, in terms of equity goals, in terms of water quality, sustainable land management, and so on. And so these ecosystem-based adaptation approaches draw on ecological principles and work with natural processes. And one of the themes of the overall report, this wasn't just true for the food systems chapter, but was true for the report as a whole, was really emphasizing the scientific evidence that there are these deep connections between supporting biodiversity and ecosystems and bolstering climate change adaptation, this strong connection, which sometimes gets ignored. And so I'm going to highlight some examples of what that might look like within food systems in a few minutes. But we also did an assessment of what is kind of the status quo for food production globally, which is agricultural intensification, sometimes thought of as land-sparing approaches. So intensively using some land with use of chemically based fertilizer and pesticides and mechanization and monocropping. And there is a robust evidence in the literature that this intensification approach increases greenhouse gas emissions because of the fossil fuel-based fertilizer and pesticides and fuel use, as well as land use change, and may have negative impacts on things like biodiversity, soil erosion, salinization, water quality. And importantly, while there may be short-term production overall, it actually often displaces local food producers and worsens their food security and livelihoods. So overall, there were numerous studies showing that the overall impact can increase climate risk and vulnerability, and particularly for marginalized groups, such as smallholder farmers. And in addition to this focus on agricultural intensification and the implications of that approach to food production, we found in the literature a lot of evidence of risk of maladaptation. So adaptation that's undertaken, an action that's undertaken for climate change adaptation, that can lead to negative impacts, such as increased greenhouse gas emissions, worsening status for particular groups, or ecosystem degradation, or a combination of those different negative impacts. And the literature suggests that it's often these marginalized, already disadvantaged groups, which again vary by place. So maybe indigenous groups in one location, it might be farm workers in another location, or low-income households. But these most already disadvantaged groups have experienced the worst impacts from maladaptation. And it's not that it's always a particular option that leads to maladaptation, but it may be the process by which adaptation takes place that leads to maladaptation. In the food systems literature, so this was true overall for the report, that there's evidence of maladaptation in many different sectors. But in the food systems literature, there was evidence, for example, of irrigation, which is often taken as a form of climate change adaptation, which can lead to salinization of soil. It can lead to groundwater depletion, and that in turn can mean some groups of communities have less access to water, drinking water. And it can also mean, depending on how irrigation is rolled out, it may mean greater indebtedness for farmers, and it can mean that particular farmers are worse off, aren't able to compete with those farmers who can afford irrigation and lose their livelihoods as a consequence. And there were several examples of that. One, for example, in Spain, which led to lower production of fruits and vegetables by smallholder farmers and fewer smallholder farmers able to afford the irrigation and going out of business, and an increase in large-scale commodity crops. So an overall lower access to fruits and vegetables within the region, and more smallholder farmers going out of business. And so that is not necessarily irrigation per se, but how irrigation is, how it's implemented as an adaptation strategy. So the literature has some suggestions about how to avoid maladaptation, and it means taking into account these environmental, sociocultural, and political and economic processes. So thinking about ensuring the protection of ecosystems in the adaptation strategy, thinking about the local sociocultural context and taking that into account, making sure that local community members benefit and gain capacity in the adaptation strategy being rolled out, and having inclusive processes by which an adaptation strategy is implemented. And so overall, this is part of a broader message in our assessment from the scientific literature, showing that addressing, in order to have really effective and not have maladaptation, it's important to include attention to social inequities in the adaptation strategy. So having approaches that involve these marginalized and vulnerable groups in the design and planning and implementation of the adaptation strategies. So technical approaches that ignore these inequities, these power differences, these social inequities, can worsen climate impacts for those groups and lead to overall worse outcomes. And another important feature of climate change adaptation strategies that are effective are really drawing on a broad range of knowledge systems. So recognition of Indigenous and local knowledge in the adaptation strategy, but also different ways of communicating adaptation strategies and climate risks. So incorporating the arts, using community-based adaptation methods, using citizen science for people to measure changes in their food systems, doing participatory modeling methods. There's a whole host of experimentation and research that's been done within food systems and more broadly around incorporating these different learning strategies and knowledge sources, and evidence that using these a wider range of both knowledge and ways of pedagogical approaches, educational approaches, can increase awareness, people's awareness of the issue and their risk perception around climate change impacts, and influence their decision to take action. So one example, not from North America, but from West and East Africa, is the use of developing a seasonal forecasting system that uses Indigenous knowledge in the system, and was developed in consultation with and collaboration with pastoralists who helped to develop the seasonal forecasting system and then tested it to make sure it worked in their conditions. And the adaptation literature goes beyond focusing only on production, but for really preparing for climate risks in all dimensions of the food system, the literature suggests an importance of thinking about the mitigation and adaptation together, and thinking about different aspects of the food system. So, for example, taking into account food loss and waste, thinking about the implications of different adaptation strategies on food consumption patterns. We didn't focus on the dietary implications in terms of mitigation, but there is strong evidence that overconsumption of meat and some other foods can increase greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking about, and that varies by place, but thinking about changing your adaptation strategy and taking into account the dietary needs and the impacts of the adaptation strategy is an important strategy. So having a sort of differentiated set of responses based on climate risks and other risks within the local context. So I'm going to give you some examples. I can't see my own timer. Okay, I'm going to give you a few examples. One is social protection programs. So this is providing cash or support for strengthening assets that may reduce your climate risk for regions or particular marginalized groups in advance of any event happening. So for example, forecast-based financing that would give funds in advance to vulnerable groups that were at greater risk from an extreme event such as flooding. This has been used quite successfully in a number of parts of the world. Another example is supporting local diverse food producers. So finding ways to support them to incorporate these different ecosystem-based approaches and providing public procurement of diverse foodstuffs that they've produced from these ecosystem-based approaches and funneling those diverse foods into homegrown school food programs to try to increase the dietary diversity in school meals. Community-based mangrove restoration. So thinking about mangroves as a protection against storm surges and floods, but also as a means to increase biodiversity and provide fisheries and other wild foods for food security and livelihoods, and as a means for mitigation. So you see here this kind of combination. It's mitigation, it's adaptation, it's addressing livelihoods, it's addressing biodiversity, and it's reducing climate risk. There are trade-offs with all adaptation strategies, and this may conflict with other livelihood strategies depending on the region, but this is an example of this kind of integrated approach. Another example is silvopastoral systems, so having livestock with trees, which provides shade and other health benefits for livestock. So you get an increase in crop and animal productivity. You may get another livelihood source as a farmer from the tree crop and carbon sequestration. So again, you have these multiple benefits and synergies between mitigation and adaptation, again, with trade-offs where you need capacity building. It's a more complex system. You may need some infrastructure support. You may need to develop markets for the tree crops or for tree crop products, for example. Another example in the urban setting, I know this is not as much your area, but just thinking about it in the North American context, is urban gardens in low-income neighborhoods. So urban gardens can increase access to fruits and vegetables and a source of livelihoods for low-income households. There's evidence that it can foster community networks and actually have impacts on mental health. And it provides a cooling sink during heat waves. And many low-income urban neighborhoods have very little green spaces. So this is an important role. Again, there's trade-offs and things to think about in making sure that you are actively involving low-income households in the planning of gardens so that it meets their needs, addressing issues around access to land and capacity building in gardening. And there's issues around contaminated soils that have to be addressed often in urban landscapes. And then a final example is agroecosystem diversification. There is robust scientific literature. There's meta-analysis of meta-analysis showing the benefits, both in terms of reducing climate risk and other ecosystem service benefits for agroecosystem diversification. So this is everything from intercropping, crop rotation, having more diversified plants along field margins, things like hedgerows, agroforestry, and these provide many regulating and supporting ecosystem services such as pest control, soil health improvements, pollination, water regulation, and buffering of temperature extremes while maintaining or sometimes increasing yield productivity and yield stability. So greater stability under different climate events and under rising temperatures. And so an example from one study in Canada compared a diverse set of crop rotations versus monocropped corn under different climate scenarios, and they found both positive yield impacts, yield stability, and increased soil organic carbon under RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, so different climate scenarios. And so you get the benefit of reduced sensitivity to precipitation variability, reduced yield loss, and this mitigation benefit as well. So that's an example that's highly relevant for the North American context. Of course, it has to be adapted to the given context, both agroecosystem context, as well as markets and sociocultural context. And we did a sort of focus on agroecosystem diversification because of the robust evidence for its potential as an adaptation strategy. There are a number of barriers highly relevant in the North American context, a lot of current policy disincentives, such as subsidies that go in the opposite direction at the moment, and limited research and investment in this as an adaptation strategy, with a lot of producers having low access to seeds, infrastructure, and markets, as well as the knowledge. They would need capacity building in order to switch to this kind of a system. But there are also in the literature a number of strategies that have been tested and shown to support increased agroecosystem diversification, such as diverting subsidies from a focus on monocropped commodities to diversified systems, public procurement that helps to encourage diversified production, also programs that support shorter regional value chains, things like regional food hubs, supporting agritourism, and payments for ecosystem services. These are all strategies that can be used to support moving towards agroecosystem diversification. And I thought if there was time, I would give an example, but from my own research, but I'm going to skip that. If you're interested, I can tell you about it later, but just to know that my own research, I've done work on agroecological practices in Malawi and Tanzania as a climate change adaptation strategy and to address food security and nutrition. And we've found it to be quite effective, but in order for it to be effective, one has to pay attention to gender and other social inequalities. And to note that in order to support these range of adaptation strategies that also serve as mitigation strategies, there needs to be political commitment and follow through in terms of enabling conditions overall, with institutional frameworks, policies, and instruments that have clear focus, clear goals and priorities around climate change adaptation and mitigation, as well as monitoring and evaluation. And there needs to be mobilization to adequate financial resources. That probably isn't a surprise to you, and inclusive government processes that really encourage moving towards resilient food production systems. So with that, I know I wanted to leave enough time for questions, and according to my clock, I think I'm at just about the right time. So just to acknowledge my colleagues who helped with the work of putting together the Working Group 2 report, and I hope I didn't go too quickly.
No, I think that was an excellent presentation, and we certainly have plenty of time for questions. And anyone who would like to ask, certainly raise your hand if you'd like to ask verbally, or put whatever you would like in the chat, and I will be sure that your question gets answered. Roz.
Yeah, I have a question. So I am on a team that runs the Utah Farmers Market Network. And this year, in the recent legislative session, the local food advisory council got cut. And our farmers markets often struggle with support from the state. And you mentioned systems level change needing to happen. Not only is there a lack of support for local food in the state, but then also the federal government is subsidizing monocrop systems. And so the burden of these barriers cannot fall on the small scale growers. So I'm just curious what your ideas are potentially to how to actually meaningfully push the needle on systems level change for local food, because I'm not seeing it happen at the Utah level. And I don't mean to be so depressing. I'm just, I guess, a little depressed about it.
Thanks for that good question, Roz, and I'm sorry to hear that about Utah. And I don't have a magic answer or a kind of quick answer. I think that recognizing opportunities for building alliances where there is shared interest is important. So thinking about, for example, health benefits from access to diverse food, and maybe looking for opportunities for local foods to be incorporated into school foods, and also thinking about building sort of linkages to thinking about supporting rural livelihoods, and so finding finding ways to build alliances beyond producers, because I agree it's not going to be small scale producers who can really push this agenda on their own. I know in New York, under the pandemic, there was certainly an increased interest in supporting regional food systems, because of supply chain bottlenecks, and also because there was increased community interest in gaining, getting secure supply to local foods. And so it was under that time period that there was funding put in place to support local producers having their foods procured for actual different emergency food systems programs. So that was an alliance that came about unexpectedly because of the pandemic, but it's an example where maybe there can be ways to think about building alliances, not to underplay the very real barriers that you're talking about, which are very significant. I don't know if that is a good enough answer.
I'll take it. I'd love more clarity, but I'll pass it on.
Okay, we do have a note in the chat that NRCS is currently well-funded to support CSAF practices and other agroecological agroforestry practices. So, David, your hand is up.
Yeah, maybe while others are thinking, thank you, Rachel. So you're also in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, part of the land-grant university system, broadly speaking, as I'm pretty sure like almost everybody on this call is. How do you kind of see, one of the things I've been thinking about is an extension, someone with an extension title, which many, if not all of us have, is how we can connect more effectively to the research faculty in our institutions who are working, and let's just stick with the food system kind of work that we're doing. And I just kind of wonder if you have any thoughts about that, particularly in the context of social sciences, which I think you represent, but as someone who's a social scientist who interacts with also a lot of people in other disciplines, at least in the work you were just talking about.
So the question is how to connect extension more to research faculty?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question because I'm not an extension faculty. I was hired for research, and almost all my research is in Africa. But I think one of the ways that I've been drawn into research activities related to um, national and regional food systems is really through teaching. Um, Strangely, maybe, but because I teach different courses on food systems, and I've been coordinating a community food systems minor, that has led me to interact much more with local producers and with faculty who are doing research on the ag science side. So I don't know if that is one mechanism for encouraging greater involvement of research faculty and faculty in the social sciences, but that is how I initially got brought into these questions within the New York context.
Thanks for that answer, because you're not the only person that I've seen who kind of started engaging more with sort of off-campus community work through their teaching role, who had other kind of non-extension responsibilities. I think that's good to remember.
We have one question that is currently being typed out. Oh, and this is it. All right. Tracy says, I would like to see more intersection of health and gardens and small scale growers. We experience air quality indices of over 400, and I've asked all gardeners to stay indoors. I'm not sure what programs would cover this.
I don't know what programs would cover this. Sorry. I don't know. Sorry to have a bad answer. I mean, they're very related to health and air quality, heat stress, urban gardens, but I can't say off the top of my head what programs would support that.
Okay. Cynthia, I'm going to read this and we'll see if it makes sense verbally. Is there a trickle down of information into more detail for local, state, or county level to, one, help policymakers and officials understand these issues, two, national organizations which can be a jumping off to state or county levels to reach industry, three, programs in place or venues to reach underserved population subgroups? And there are examples that I did not list off because I have a hard time verbalizing parentheticals.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments there?
Trickle down information. I know that there are youth BIPOC farmer organizations in New York, and I think they've been an important sort of group advocating for support.
Rachel, I might make a comment while you're
Please
thinking.
do, please do.
So one of the things that I'm aware of, which isn't specifically related to food systems, because I don't really work on food systems myself, but there's been a transition, I would say, in the global dialogues, particularly in the climate dialogues, towards adaptation in general, adding adaptation very forcefully to the agenda in a way that it used to be focused on mitigation side, reducing greenhouse gases. And as at the same time, and partly because of that, there's been increasing attention to what they call multi-level processes, which is like, how do we, essentially what this question is about, as I understand it, which is how do we translate some of the dialogue that's going on at the global scale into state and local policy in coordinated ways. So I think this is still, you know, from a global perspective, this kind of looking at subnational measures is still pretty new and evolving rapidly. But it's going to be an increasing part of what we're going to be seeing happen in the future.
And you got a thumbs up from the question asker. So I think you hit on it well enough there. Art,
And
you have your hand
I
up?
will just say that, you know, in the one other thing, in the global dialogue, there's an official constituency called the local LGMA, the Local Government and Municipal Authorities Constituency, which is kind of an officially recognized constituency at the COPs, and they advocate explicitly for more quote unquote multi-level action collectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe this isn't answering your question, but I know from my own experience, I got involved during the pandemic in a county level initiative that was initiated by myself and some local producers that I knew because of connecting with them for teaching and other reasons. Producers, but then also people working on emergency food and people working with farm workers. And we formed a task force, COVID-19 food system task force for the county. And we met weekly to kind of share strategies. And this may seem a far cry from climate preparedness, but that task force led to finding a building where local farmers could store. There was refrigerator. It was donated by someone locally, where then farmers could store food there, and then it was then moved into redistributing to low-income households with local nonprofit organizations. So again, that it was a county level initiative that led to a lot more sharing of information across multiple sectors related to the food system, and actions that led to more procurement of local diverse foods and more information sharing that is helpful in the case of climate risk. And some of those systems are still operating. And it also led to kind of advocacy at the state level to get more support for local foods. So yeah, the kind of county level organizing across sectors led to kind of multi-level response to some extent.
Okay. Art, you have been patient. If you would like to ask a question, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering on the scenarios that you had mentioned that had been run with different factors being changed in them. Was there any, I guess, touching upon a transition from fossil to biofuels? I know it always brings up the food versus fuel fight, whether it's ethanol or whether it's pressed oils or such, but was there in the different scenarios, I guess, a consideration of an augmentation of what kind of energy we use, or was that kind of out of the picture?
So I think you're talking about are you talking, so when you say scenarios, you mean at the beginning of my presentation, the sort of different risks, or do you mean when I was talking about diversification?
Diversification.
Yeah, no, it was just using these RCP scenarios, which are the kind of climate futures under different degrees, and I don't think they take biofuels into account. And that does fall more into it is goofy, but it does fall more into the mitigation side, and that's a different working group.
Okay.
I wish it was the same one.
Understood.
I think they would have done modeling under, you know, what is the potential for biofuels along with other alternative energies to fossil fuels. I don't think that paper looked at that.
Okay. Dennis was wondering if you could comment on the social inequity aspects of your research interests in Africa, particularly because he's worked in Nigeria himself.
Sure, Dennis. I'll just make it brief and hope it is relevant for this audience. What I've found, and I've done collaborative interdisciplinary and participatory research for over 2 decades in Malawi and Tanzania, is in order for these agroecological approaches to really have benefits in terms of food security and nutrition and livelihoods, gender inequities and other social inequities need to be addressed as part of the kind of overall approach. Or you can actually worsen outcomes for women and for children. So you might increase productivity by doing legume intercrops and improving soil health, for example. But then if the husband is taking the legume crop and selling it and using it for alcohol consumption, which was what was happening initially in some of our work, and it's increasing workloads for women because of the increased number of crops being grown and more intensive management of land to improve soil fertility, then you actually can worsen child nutrition outcomes and overall household food security. But in contrast, if we explicitly addressed gender and other social inequities and used a participatory approach where the farming communities are involved in strategies to try to address gender inequities, we've shown that we can increase women's autonomy. We've been able to improve the sort of division of labor in terms of more equal sharing of household tasks and decision-making within farming communities. And we've even looked at mental health outcomes for women under these strategies and shown an improvement in women's probable depression or lowered incidence of women's probable depression using this approach. So very different context from North America, but I think you could think about ways to explicitly address social inequities, which would be different in this context, but social inequities, gender and others, income, ethnic inequities, and how to explicitly address them in extension work rather than only looking at the agricultural technological intervention, if you will.
So perhaps I'm making the wrong inference, but what I hear you say is if the female goes out, sells the legumes, and does the boozing, everyone would be better off?
Such a good question. Yeah, you can't assume that women aren't going to misuse resources. And this is not to essentialize women's roles, but there is some pretty good evidence, at least in the African context, that if women are more involved in decision-making around agricultural production and control over agricultural resources, more of those resources will be invested in children and children's health and children's nutrition for a whole host of different reasons. And as well, so it's not just that the strategy is, oh, let's give the legumes to women, but also actively involving men in the conversation about the implications of boozing it up, if you will. I think you can imagine if you were in a highly food insecure household and facing, tremendous poverty, it would be tempting to get drunk with the little resources you had if you saw no potential for a better outcome. And that's not to excuse or simplify what happens in rural communities, but I think I can understand that feeling of hopelessness that leads to misuse of resources. And so bringing conversations about to try to encourage a different way of using the resources and thinking about relationships differently is part of what I've been involved in. very social sciencey. Now I've scared everyone. They're running.
Apparently not David. And we've got time for one more question. So David, why don't you
Only if no
That's
one
it.
else has one. But Rachel probably knows they never run out of questions, so. So this may be more of a mitigation, shifting to adaptation kind of thought process, but you kind of like talked about how I think the scientific community has concluded, as probably most of us would all feel, that the level of transformative change that is necessary to deal with climate change is at best just starting. And certainly not at a pace and scale that we need it to happen. So in that context, when I think about what the work that was published about the measures needed or recommended really on the adaptation side, do you see them as being kind of beyond incrementalist in some way? In other words, do I think they really have the potential to sort of create transformative change? I'm not even necessarily talking globally, because I don't think that's quite as important at the let's say within Malawi, where you do your work. Do you think there's a possibility for truly transformative change that really gets ahead of the climate changes that are happening, or is it really incremental still?
I mean, so far it's been too incremental, but I do see the potential for transformative change with the kinds of examples that I gave. Yeah. Yes, so far it's been too slow, too incremental. Governments haven't been kind of investing heavily in really pushing for that transformative change. Particularly in the agriculture and food sector, I think we see more efforts at really transforming the energy, like the home heating and transportation sectors, which are crucial in North America. We have to transform those, but there's been in North America less willingness to really tackle in a transformational way what needs to happen in the agriculture and food sector. We have seen that a little bit in Europe, and there's been pushback, and then governments have kind of stepped back a little from that. So yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
Just looking for a scientific one.
Well, I think we're coming to the top of the hour, and I know the chat has been very lively with appreciation for your talk today, the answers to your questions, and the kindness in admitting when you don't know an answer. So with that, thank you, Rachel, for joining us. Thank you, everyone who joined us, for your participation. We look forward to seeing you next month, where we have Sean Parks with the U.S. Forest Service lined up to give a talk on the 3rd. And please have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind comments in the chat.
And Hans, you see about the chat being available? I think it will be.